Moving on to a story that it started, I believe, last week, but I think is finally, shockingly, the record is getting straight from the New York Times, of all places. The New York Times, of all places. So Bernie Sanders, on the anniversary of, yes, he went to Memphis, Tennessee, on the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination. And he made a comment about President Obama that the neoliberal establishment went bonkers about. Quote, the business model, if you like, of the Democratic Party for the last 15 years or so has been a failure, said Bernie. People sometimes don't see that because there was a charismatic individual named Barack Obama. He was obviously an extraordinary candidate, brilliant guy. But behind that reality over the last 10 years, Democrats have lost about 1,100 seats in state legislatures all across this country. Controversial, right? Controversial that on the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination, Bernie had the audacity to compliment the first African-American president as a very charismatic politician. I don't know what is controversial about that. He wasn't saying he was just pretty face but unintelligent. He said nothing negative about, frankly, if it were me, that's why I should be a politician, because I'm not a graceful speaker. But if it were me, I wouldn't even give him the charisma. Yeah, he was charismatic, and he fooled a lot of people. So, I mean, the Neera Tanden crowd, the neoliberal Democratic hacks, I mean, they just went absolutely bonkers on Twitter. This New York Times piece says it best. Twitter erupted immediately, and critics like former South Carolina Representative Bakari Sellers, who's a CNN analyst, a neoliberal hack, accused Sanders of, quote, arrogance and of, quote, dismissing President Obama. I think Bakari Sellers actually said, put out a tweet this date that Bernie said that is officially the end of Bernie Sanders' revolution. I think he said something like that. But this reporter from the New York Times said, hey, you know, I love to knock the New York Times, MSNBC, all of them. But if they do something well, I don't have a problem complimenting them. So this reporter traveled with Bernie, and she set the record straight. But Thursday's critiques were only loosely tethered to Wednesday's words on their face, which were fairly uncontroversial. Who could defend as successful the, quote, almost unprecedented loss of legislative seats over the last 10 years, or Hillary Clinton's defeat to game show host Donald Trump? In Mississippi, when Sanders called the Democratic Party a failure, the audience erupted into applause. And of course, President Obama was a uniquely charismatic and brilliant president. So this New York Times reporter is speaking the truth. In fact, if Beale Street could talk, it would tell a very different story about Bernie Sanders than the now familiar critique that he is insufficiently sensitive to racial issues. As I walked with Sanders down Memphis's famous thoroughfare, his popularity, including among the predominantly black crowd attending the commemorative festivities, was self-evident. The senator was stopped every few feet by selfie seekers and admirers. Yes, perhaps this is to be expected of any politician with a national profile, but given his poor showing in Mississippi during the 2016 Democratic primary, in which he secured less than 17% of the black vote, I had thought the senator and his small cohort might go unnoticed. I was wrong. Oh, how refreshing to hear that from a corporate media journalist. Hey, you got to give credit where credit is due. You got to give credit where credit is due. That New York Times reporter, she got in the field. She was with Bernie. Bernie said what he said about Obama to most objective people who aren't deranged in the head or just part of the Democratic Party neoliberal consultant class. And everybody, make sure, each one of you, press this share button. Let's get this to more people. On the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, Bernie Sanders complimented the first African-American president as being charismatic. He didn't say he was unintelligent. He didn't say he was lazy. He didn't say he got nothing done. He complimented him. But to Bakari Sellers and the Hillbots on Twitter, love calling them Hillbots, this was This proved that Bernie's a racist. None of them want to actually, I challenged one of them on Twitter last week. I said, okay, so the man who got arrested during the civil rights movement, the man who has actually lets black people talk. Do you remember when the Black Lives Matter people interrupted his rally and he gracefully stepped to the back and let them talk? As opposed to Hillary Clinton, who, when a Black Lives Matter person interrupted her wealthy donor private fundraiser, Hillary just said, "Oh, somebody get her, somebody throw her out." And, we're going to continue to see this. We're halfway to the midterms. The day after the midterms, it's already onward to 2020. I happen to believe Bernie will be running as long as his health is there. I believe he will be running. But there's this nonsense and these distortions that the neoliberal Democratic establishment is trying to push, that Bernie Sanders is somehow racially insensitive. Some of them just say he's straight up racist. Well, why is it? Maybe they don't want to address that his policies would disproportionately help African Americans, would disproportionately help Latinos, would disproportionately help Native Americans. They'd help those groups a lot more than me. It's not that white people aren't struggling either, but historically, black people, brown people, Native Americans have struggled a lot more economically. So Bernie Sanders, free health care, and it's not free, we pay a little more in taxes, would help all these classes of people that they're trying to claim he's a racist against. Free public college tuition would help people, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, that might need help to get an education. And by the way, there's a lot of well-educated African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans. So this is not a generalization, but these are the facts. Bernie Sanders would help all of these groups. His policies of actually taxing wealthy people more while giving tax cuts to working poor and middle class people would not only help the working class and middle class people, but they would actually help the wider economy. But no. Bakari Sellers says he's an extremist, he's a racist because he had the audacity to compliment the first African-American president. You can't make it up. And you know what? Remember this day, Thursday, April 12th. I want you to remember this day because I'm about to make a prediction, and I bet your bottom dollar it's going to happen. Speaking of dollars, just saying, if Bernie Sanders runs again for president, they will come after him and his wife for their honeymoon in Russia. They will start just asking. We're just asking questions. Who did he meet with during his honeymoon in Russia? Mark my words, folks. I know how the corporate media works. I used to work in the corporate media. I'm still recovering. They are going to go after Bernie. They are going to keep pushing this nonsense that Russian trolls was really the reason his movement was so large. Just like they say Russian trolls are behind the Standing Rock movement being so large and Black Lives Matter. Pretty soon they're going to say Russian trolls were behind the civil rights movement. Pretty soon they're going to say Russian trolls killed JFK, if that's even possible.